Welcome to the wonderful world of wine, exploring all things wine with you. We are your hosts, Kim Simone and Mark Lenzi, and every week we introduce you to trending topics in the wine world. We are supported by Franklin Public Radio, and you can find us on our website, thewww.wine. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the wonderful world of wine. I'm here with my co-host, Mark Lenzi. How are you this week, Mark?
Everything is great, Kim. Always good to talk wine with you.
Absolutely. So we are kind of breaking tradition a little bit this week. We are going to not have a guest, and we are going to talk about some articles that have been published most recently in the wine world. And we're going to be talking a little bit about grape varieties, mass production of wine, different types of wine that are out there in the market, and maybe what is a little bit better for you to be drinking and why.
Sounds good. We need that. We need to know why, Kim.
Yeah, we need to
We have
know the
so
why.
much information to give the listeners.
That's
Hope
right. So the first one that we wanted to talk about is a little bit of an older article, but it is an editorial about why you should stop buying mass-produced wine. And this was in the Wine Industry Advisor. And a lot of these articles that we actually have been planning on talking about today are geared towards people who are in the wine industry. So we've got some articles about the reasons why you might want to use a cork in a bottle versus a screw cap, or about particular grape varieties and how that can impact your labeling. But this one in particular is geared a little bit more towards the consumer, and how can you find better quality, better tasting wine without necessarily buying those big brands that are on every grocery store shelf. And I know that this is something that you run into a lot, Mark, and it has sort of infiltrated every part of our industry, these commodity wines, I suppose you can call them.
Yeah, well, first, Kim, there's so much lately in the news, and our listeners probably seeing this about the bad news about alcohol and wine and our health. So there really has to be something we can do to educate more, I feel, on how we can shop better and healthier for wine. And I started to design some classes so we could kind of really focus on that for people.
Oh, that's
But
great.
first, I wanted to ask you, the article was saying stop buying mass-produced wines, and you kind of hinted a little bit, but I like your definition of mass-produced wine.
This is such a great question, Mark. And I think one of the hard things about the job that the consumer has to do in the market in choosing a bottle is that it is very hard for you, Josephine Q. Public, to go into a store and look at the vast array of wine on a shelf and be able to say, that is a mass market wine and that one is not a mass market wine. It is really, really hard to tell just by looking at a label what you should be buying to make the best decision about buying small and all of that stuff. So this is something that education can play a role in, but I think that on the production side, these larger wine companies that will put out all these different labels and different brands where it might actually be very similar juice in the bottle are making it hard for consumers to understand what is just a brand versus what is a wine that has more of a handcrafted kind of nature to it. So I know that one of the first things that you point your students to, Mark, is look on the back label and look at who is producing it and where is it coming from. And if it is this vast region, so if it just says California or if it just says the United States, that's an indication that this is a more mass-produced kind of wine, as opposed to does it have a smaller appellation or location attributed to it, in which case chances are it's a little bit of a smaller production and a little bit more of a handcrafted type of wine.
Yeah, you hear a lot of times mass-produced, you hear it related to grocery wines, and I don't really like that thing, grocery wines, but I'd like the listeners to know what's the difference. So a grocery store or a box store needs to really source from certain things where they can guarantee if you walk into this store here and you go in another town to that same chain, you're going to probably see the same product, but that wine has to be available. So to me, that would be what I call a mass produced wine. You're going to see it in all the same stores because they can supply it. They can
Yeah.
make enough to supply it. And that goes back to, we talk a lot to our listeners about that 90% versus 10%. So really 90% of what you're seeing are these mass produced or grocery store type wines. It doesn't mean they're bad wines. It doesn't mean they're bad quality wines. It just means they're made in huge quantities to be able to supply the demand for the bigger stores, for the big grocery stores. First, I want to get that out of the way. It doesn't mean it's bad quality, but they were saying in this article that the average American, how can they tell like the quality and what is bulk and mass
Hmm.
produced? That's some of the way you can tell by the label and regions and just doing some simple searching on that wine.
Yeah. So they did talk about price a little bit, and that there's now this, it used to be that there was plenty of wine in like an under $10 category of cheap and cheerful. I have a
Yeah.
colleague who loves to use the phrase cheap and cheerful for kind of everyday, not the best quality, but easy to drink and great with a burger or with pizza.
Not
It's oh,
cheap, inexpensive.
inexpensive. Oh, sorry,
Right.
Mark. Oh, I
No,
was
no,
falling
I
into
mean,
that
we
trap.
always say that. Don't say
Joanne says
cheap, say,
cheap and cheerful, so that's
yeah,
why I I fall back on that.
inexpensive and cheerful. You got
Inexpensive.
to tell her that.
Yeah. But whether it's just that prices on everything have increased, it's very, very hard to find anything really drinkable under $10. So now it's like, well, what used to be under $10 is now under $15. And so now that threshold of sort of commodity wine versus more special wine is at more the $20 range. I think that that is more specific to California wine. I think there is still plenty of things from lesser known regions that are under 20 and maybe even under 15 that can be great values and interesting and unique and fun to drink and tasty, that don't necessarily have to go over $20 a bottle. But you, the consumer, probably need a little bit more help finding those. So that's where it comes down to shopping or having dinner at a place that has people on staff who know about wine and can carefully curate a selection of things that won't break the bank and are interesting and tasty and will work for you.
Yeah, just a couple of things they mentioned I thought were interesting for our listeners to know in this article that U.S. retail wine sales, it's $80 billion compared to beef sales are 30 billion and eggs are 15 billion. So people are buying more wine than beef and eggs. So I thought that was kind of an interesting number. It's a lot, and we lead the world really in total wine consumption, and most of that is dominated by the mass-produced wines
But that's
that
not per capita consumption.
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 Right, right.
We're a big country full of a
Yeah,
lot of
a lot
people.
of people.
So
Right.
there's a
Yeah, I
lot of
think
people
what
in this
was
country.
we used to joke about what was like Switzerland or Luxembourg or something. It's something really small is the world leader, correct? It's like a really small.
Yeah, it's like,
Yeah. We drink a lot
yeah,
of
yeah.
wine.
It's one of
But
those like tiny little Mediterranean countries that, yeah. And the
yeah.
Vatican. Don't forget the Vatican.
And there was something in here also about 7 out of 10 bottles sold. They would call them paint by numbers wines or altered wines. And I wanted to see what you thought about calling them paint by numbers, which,
Well, I
maybe our
mean,
listeners heard it before or not heard it before. A lot of
maybe.
people in the industry have heard it.
I
Would you
mean,
consider paint by number wines a mass produced wine? It's a formula or it's
so
a.
I would say yes, if there's a formula behind, like, all right, if you blend this flavor profile and this flavor profile and have this amount of residual sugar and this amount of acidity, then you're going to get something that is pleasing to a larger number of palates out there. So yeah, I kind of get that. Often is at the crux of this argument, right? It's the, should wines be made in the style that is unique to this grape variety in this particular place? Or should wine be produced so that it appeals to the masses? So I kind of feel like there's something there for everybody. I think there is a place for both styles. I think that people who enjoy drinking certain styles of wine, other styles of wine aren't necessarily going to appeal to them. So if you like fresh and fruity and maybe not super alcoholic, if I was to throw something in front of you that's from, I don't know, Austria or the Savoie in France that's a little bit funky, that might not taste so good to you because you're used to a completely different style of wine. So
Yeah.
I think there's a place for a lot of things. And I want to encourage the continuation of our industry. And I would prefer, especially given the climate of this sort of neo-prohibitionist thing, the last thing I want is infighting within our industry. So make the wine that you want to make, sell it to who your customer is. I think there's room for everybody.
And you mentioned something earlier about finding that lower price point wine that is good quality. And that's something every year is harder and harder for me as a wine buyer
Yeah.
to find something that someone will bring to me. And the big thing with salespeople, they don't like to tell you the price. They want you to guess it. And it's more nowadays that I taste it and I don't like it and it costs way more than I think it should. But every once in
Like,
a
I'm definitely
while,
not buying
yeah,
this.
and it's very rare that I will say, "Oh, that is great," and they'll say, "Oh, that's a $10 bottle." I'm
Yeah.
like, "Oh my God!" It's like, "Whoa!" It's like sirens go off, and like,
That's not specific to wine. I mean, you buy a loaf of bread for $5 in the grocery store.
yeah,
You know,
yeah, I see, yeah.
it's
It's
not just wine. It's
it's
so many
harder and harder
things.
though.
Yeah.
So we were talking about cheap wine. There was another article in the
Cheap
new
wine.
new wine review article that said, "Sorry, California, no one wants your cheap bulk wine anymore." And this was more related to the sourcing of bulk wine than people buying consumers
Right.
buying bulk wine. So did you want to give a little feedback on that, Kim?
Yeah, so this was more of a sort of conversation about the overabundance of planting and how much excess wine there is. And this one was specific to California, but this has been an ongoing problem in Europe for decades that sometimes plantings outweigh the amount of wine that people actually want to consume. So, in a lot of places, wine will actually be made and then that wine will be distilled into alcohol, which is one way to deal with the problem. But in other places, the vines will just be ripped out. And there's always this sort of number of years or time of like adjustment and catch up because wine and grapevines in particular, you can't just change them on a dime. It's an agricultural product, like it's like an apple tree, right? So you need a number of years in order for that plant to be producing the fruit that you need in order for it to produce the wine that you ultimately want to get from it. So it's not like you can change it in September and by the next year you're going to have a completely new crop of or style of grapes that you can make a new type of wine out of. So it's a slow changing process. And when people react to trends very quickly, sometimes mistakes are made. So we're kind of seeing that a couple of decades ago, there was overplanting in California of certain grape varieties or certain styles. And then those went out of fashion. And now there's all this excess grapes. But it's also a bit of a change of how people are drinking wine now. So back to the idea of people are drinking less of this inexpensive wine or cheap wine. People are still drinking wine, but maybe less of it in a higher price point, which means that by volume, people are drinking less wine. They might be paying a little bit more for it so that the wineries are actually still making kind of the same amount of money, but by volume, it's gone down. So there is a movement in a lot of places to rip up a lot of grapevines and get rid of a lot of these vines that maybe were producing this less expensive wine that in the past had been able to go into bulk wine for places like grocery stores or Trader Joe's or what have you. And there just isn't the market for that anymore. So that's what the nobody wants your cheap wine anymore.
Yeah.
a
Well, there's a
label kind of came
few
from.
points you made. The farmers who are growing grapes for mass-produced wine or bulk wine, like you said, Kim, there might have been a trend. Hey, Pinot Grigio is hot right now. So they
Yeah.
rip up their vines, they plant Pinot Grigio. 4 years later, Pinot Grigio might not be trending so much, or it's not needed. So now they
Yeah.
wasted all that. No one wants the grapes. But we also talked about this, a story about this not too long ago, where a lot of the mass produced big companies are sourcing now from outside the United States because they're getting tax benefits. So that's
Mm-hmm.
also hurting the bulk wine growers. And I wish when we had Randy on the show about Lodi was one of those regions that was known to be sourced for bulk wine for a lot of the California wineries.
Yeah.
And I think their production is down because they're not getting sourced as much. So it's a big issue. There was a survey showing that just wine is now the least preferred alcoholic beverage, and things are down. So
Yeah, it never used to be that way. I remember it
yeah.
used to be spirits, and that it was like beer was number one, wine was number two, and spirits was number three.
Yep. So the wine, they don't need as much volume. They're getting discounts sourcing bulk wines from other countries. So they only have to put 75% of American juice in there, and they can put 25% of other source juice. So if the mass produced companies stop sourcing 25% of their fruit from the United States, that really impacts that bulk wine. And that's why
Yeah.
I think they were saying nobody wants it, meaning the trend is changing.
Mm-hmm.
So one last thing we'll get in before a break here, Kim, just talking about something about the TTB. This is kind of a geeky thing, but an interesting thing for listeners out there, that there is what they call America's Great Grape Variety Shortage. It was in winesearcher.com. It was a story about the TTB, which regulates what is put on a label. So, Kim, what did you learn from this?
This was so fascinating. So I learned that, okay, so there are thousands of grape varieties out there that you can make wine from. And there are a few dozen that kind of most everybody knows the name of. Everybody knows Chardonnay, Pinot Noir. Got some less familiar ones like, I don't know, Semillon or Nero d'Avola and things like that. But there are like literally 10,000 grape varieties out there. But there are only 400 that you can grow them, but you can't put their name on a wine label on an American wine. I had no idea. I
Yeah,
completely
it's
learned something
like
new.
only 4% of the
Yeah.
grape varieties in the world are allowed by the USTTB to be put on a label. So,
I always assumed that, I mean, this is America. You can put whatever the heck you want on the wine label, but I was incorrect.
yeah. And originally, I think the whole idea about the government doing this was they wanted to control the phylloxera outbreak. They didn't want all these different grapes brought into the country and people to grow them. So
But it
to
didn't
prevent it,
stop the grapes from
right,
coming in. It
right.
just stopped people from being able to put the name of the grape on the label. Like,
Yeah.
that's really dumb.
And so what they kind of
Sorry.
insinuating on this is if we heard it from a guest not too long ago about how France is adapting due to climate change, they have to grow
Mm-hmm.
different grapes.
Yep.
So that's exactly what's happening in this country. There's regions where the climate is changing, the traditional grapes they grew, they want to change, and now they're finding these different varieties from Europe that grow great there and they want to grow them here, but then when they go to bottle it and submit the label to the TTB, they say you can't produce that label because that grape is not one on the list of approved grapes. So now they have to fight this process of submitting the grape, which is all known throughout the world, but not accepted by the government.
Yeah.
So it's an interesting story and sad for wineries who are producing wine. They have to come up with something else to sell it. So, for
Yeah.
instance, if it's a white grape, they just have to say white wine
Yeah.
and not be honest with the consumer.
And especially for grape growers and winemakers who are trying to do the right thing in staying ahead of climate issues.
Yeah.
They're trying to do their best in working with new grape varieties so that you don't have to use more water or more pesticides or more of these other things that are detrimental to the environment. So it's like, hey, we're going to try new grape varieties. Oh, no, sorry. By the way, you're not allowed to.
Basically, to survive as a farmer, they're doing
Yeah.
what they need to do. I wonder how that works with like a common vegetable when they're using a different strain or something. Do they have to? I don't know. I'm
I
just
don't
thinking of
know.
other products. It doesn't seem
Yeah.
like anything is like that.
Like
But
there's a whole lot of varieties of tomato seeds out there that when you walk through your local garden center. There are 2 dozen different types of tomato seeds that you can
Yeah.
buy and plant, and those are probably all regulated.
So it's just a thing about the Tobacco Tax and Trade Bureau that every time a beer producer, a wine producer, whoever, they have to submit their label to be approved before the product hits the shelf. And this is one thing that just come up lately. Only 4% of grape varieties are being allowed. So we'll follow it and see what happens in the
Yep.
future, Kim. You're listening to The Wonderful World of Wine, and we are your hosts, Mark Lenzi and Kim Simone, exploring all things wine with you. You can find all our information on our website. That's past episodes, everything about our guests. On the website is thewww.wine. You can find us on social media, The Wonderful World of Wine on Instagram and Facebook. Any questions or comments, you can find us on our Facebook page. Our program is supported by Franklin Public Radio. Welcome back. Kim and I are discussing some topics we found out there in the wine world, and just a few more we want to talk about. Real quick, Kim, I saw an article about glass bottles and wine
Mm.
bottles, and this was something it brought to my attention during COVID when there was a glass shortage.
Yeah,
Do
I
you
remember
remember
that.
hearing this?
Yeah, it was
People,
from South America or something.
the producers in the United States, they could not get enough glass because a ton of what they source for bottles comes from overseas, mainly China. And this article was talking about in 2018, 523 million 750 milliliter bottles were brought into the United States. And there was some sort of tariff put into place, our
Hmm.
famous, trending now tariffs that they wanted to put on that so it would kind of deter people from using this glass. What did you think about reading about the bottle skin? Was there anything you found that you didn't know about wine glass or
I thought it was an interesting explanation of why you want to source your wine bottles from places that have a clear line of showing you these are our production techniques. These are what we're trying to do for our environmental impact, because that's one of the main things that we talk about when we talk about glass bottles and wine is creating a glass wine bottle is very detrimental to the environment. It
yeah,
takes a lot of
non-sustainable?
resources. It's not necessarily a sustainable thing. So if you've got a glass making facility that can show you that yes, we use renewable energy, or we this percentage of the glass that we use is recycled glass, all of these things where they're trying to show that they are doing the right thing, those are the places that you should be purchasing your glass from. And one of the issues with this Chinese manufactured glass is that there are none of those fail safes. Like we don't see the receipts. So we
Right.
don't know what they're doing, how they're making it, how it's impacting the environment, how it's impacting the people who are making it. So that's one of the things about why the US government was coming down so hard on these imports of Chinese glass is because there wasn't that clear paperwork trail of showing how the glass was manufactured. So putting these tariffs in place, it did bring more focus on the American manufacturers of glass. So there were far fewer that were purchased from China and more that were used from the United States. And there were some numbers that were shown in the article. But then once those went away, then it kind of changed back. So it was just, I wouldn't say it was anything like super new. It wasn't stuff that I really had thought about before, but it was just information that I kind of was always, I guess, a little bit aware of.
Yeah, and after they put that tariff in place, the Chinese glass went down like
Yeah,
55%.
it was pretty substantial.
And the American glass manufacturers, U.S. glass manufacturers, are regulated by the EPA. So I think the whole thing that was coming out of this was, hey, in America, we monitor what's going on with this
Right.
glass
Yeah, it's the
manufacturing.
regulations.
We're worried about the environment and everything else, but you allowing these people to bring these bottles in from all over the world and no one's watching what's going on. And I was surprised. At one time, I couldn't find what the magazine was, but there was a wine publication that would break down a wine. It would tell you what cork they used, what barrels they used. And one
Mm-hmm.
little line in their article or their reviews all the time was what glass they used.
Yeah, I vaguely remember this too.
And I remember some of the most high priced Napa wines were using Chinese glass. I couldn't understand why would you use the least expensive glass you can source for the most expensive wine that you're making. I could never understand it.
Hmm.
And I always was curious, and I talked to a few winemakers about this who source glass from wherever. I always asked them, do they clean it? And I actually talked to a local distiller about this. When they get glass in, you'll notice usually you can tell if it's a plain white box that your wine is bought in, that's the glass box. And they just obviously just put the wine in it and put it back in the box. But most of them don't really have any process to clean that glass before they
Hmm.
fill it. Some blow air into it. Some, I think it's like they invert it, might wash it and dry it before it's put in. But very few even do that. So if you're talking about cleanliness, sustainability, that's something that's always in my head.
It's always in the back of your mind,
Yeah,
right?
when you're talking about things in your wine, they could be. They talk about all these particles of dust or even glass that could be in these bottles that they just fill them.
Yeah.
So I always thought that was an interesting thing. So, but
Well, I think
sustainability, I
what's
think, is the
yeah,
key.
and also, I mean, it gives reasons behind why we have so many regulations in the
Right,
United States.
right.
It's like, okay, we talk all the time about, oh, industry is overregulated and blah 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 blah, and but this really kind of laid out, well, this is why, and it's not only a consumer protection thing, but it's also an environmental protection thing, and it's a business protection thing. So I thought that that was very clearly stated in this article about what the point of having all of these regulations is.
Yeah. The other thing too, Kim, have you ever noticed, and this goes back all glass manufacturing, there's codes on the bottle where it's made.
Mm-hmm.
Have you ever looked at that?
I mean, I've noticed them, but they're, I feel like they're completely, you can't read them. I mean,
You
it's
can't
not like,
really decipher them, but
right.
I couldn't even find, like, so I figured, okay, if I can find it, how do you tell what that code is? Like, like a stamp on a piece of pottery or something,
Yeah.
And there's nothing really, I couldn't find anything on that, like a chart that would say, so, okay, so
Yeah.
it
I
is
don't
from
think,
China. Where is it? What plant is it coming from or something like that? But if you do Google stuff like that, you find the really old bottles, like people are digging up in their yards and it tells
yeah.
them what state it was made in and stuff, but nothing for mass produced
Yeah. I
glass.
feel like that stuff's like industry only
Yeah,
kind of
inside
knowledge.
secrets, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I just thought it'd be interesting if that was a way to tell people how to shop. If they're concerned about that, they could see. But I'll dig into it more, I guess. And
We know your love of labels.
yeah, just in general, just I don't know, geeky thing.
Geeky things.
All right, so next let's move on to another topic we've discussed with the listeners a lot. Cork versus a screw cap, Kim, for closures in wine.
Yeah. So this one was kind of nice because this was geared a little bit more towards the actual production side. So, like, hey, you have a winery. Why would you choose to use
Yeah.
a cork versus a screw cap?
Best for the
What's
brand, right?
best for the brand? So a lot of it was what's best for the brand. So it was like almost like a dive into the perception and the marketing of the wine. So it was less about this is what is necessarily best for the integrity of the wine and more about, well, what is the customer going to read into the fact that this bottle has a cork versus a screw cap? So it's a lot of the same stuff that we've kind of always talked about. I like to think that we are getting beyond the visceral reaction that people had 20, 25 years ago to a wine under a screw cap where it was like, this thing must be a
Cheap.
total cheapo.
Yeah.
We've got some really good wines that use screw cap. And one of the things that they brought up in this article is that wineries should be using screw caps for wines that are meant for immediate consumption. And they actually said this is a way to signal to your customer, drink this wine now. And I don't think that customers necessarily have gotten that message. I
Yeah.
mean,
Yeah.
we talk about it a lot. And I mention it in my classes that, like, okay, screw cap wines generally mean that this is not to hold on to. But I think that there is less of that knowledge out there in the marketplace. I do like that they're pushing for it because it's true, but I don't know that it necessarily signals to the majority of wine drinkers out there like, hey, drink me now.
Yeah. What about the
But I
opposite
but I
side
have
of that,
hopes.
where it said if it's a cork, people will think your brand is special because it's a
Exactly.
cork.
Well,
So,
see, that I think is still something that is alive and well in the market. And I've seen some 8.99 bottles out there that still use a cork. And I'm like, they're trying.
yeah, yeah.
They're doing their best to make their wine seem sort of fancy.
Yep. So
But yeah.
they were talking about what would be the benefits of cork as far as it shows that quality perception, the idea of romance of your wine.
Yeah. Like these are
Um,
the things we talk about a lot, right?
and
The romance of
sustainable,
wine.
because people don't think about it, but if you manufacture a screw cap or the sleeve, that takes up more energy and resources than a cork, which is most of them are natural cork, so it's just a tree. So you might think bad of a brand because it is a screw cap because of sustainability, which we mentioned prior. I mean, I don't think of that. I
Yep.
think mainly people who come in and when they're shopping for a wine, they'll say to me, I need a screw cap. I'm going somewhere. I don't know if they have a corkscrew, you know. Every time I do a talk about this, I always just say two things. I talk about the fill level. If you're
Hmm.
having a really bad day and you're picking out a wine and you want to get that little bit more, get a screw cap wine because it's filled a little higher than a wine with a cork. So,
I've started telling my students that, thanks to
yeah,
you.
it's true. There is an actual regulated fill level of a wine bottle, and the screw cap is filled up more. And the other thing is, if you're getting a gift and you want to make sure that you're going to give them a good bottle or an uncorked bottle as far as moldy, then get a screw cap because you know if they don't like it, it wasn't the wine that was bad. It was just they didn't like the style. So just a couple of things on that. I still see more natural corks and wines than the plastic. I think people are
Yeah, I
generally
think the
happy.
plastic has had its moment, and it was realized that plastic corks really were not very good for a lot of reasons. I know I broke at least a couple of corkscrews trying to get out a plastic cork.
Yeah.
So I think the new styles of natural cork, but also these sort of reconstituted cork products that use natural cork are kind of more the way to go.
So anything else on corks, Kim? Any tips for the listeners or?
Let's see.
What about this? Some listeners, they might hear that the cork actually lets the wine breathe a little bit. There is a
Mm-hmm.
little bit of oxygen that is allowed to go through, and they actually
Yeah.
rate corks and screw caps on that exposure, that breathability too.
Yeah, this idea of breathability is one of the reasons why you want a cork on something that you are intending to age. So, not every wine that you buy at the store needs to have any additional time on it, but some things do get better with time. So, if you have, say, a bottle that you're laying down for a special event or a special birthday or special anniversary, and it's a better bottle of wine, then yeah, you want to look for something that has a cork because some corks do let a little bit of oxygen in, and that will help improve the wine over time.
Yeah. It's just something people don't think about when even if it is cork, still passing some air through there.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. Thank you for listening to us today on the wonderful world of wine. We have been your hosts, Mark Lenzi and Kim Simone. You can find us at our website, thewww.wine, and we are supported by Franklin Public Radio. Our past episodes can be found on SoundCloud and iTunes. We can be found on all of your social media platforms at The Wonderful World of Wine. Cheers.
Why, why, why?